Hey everybody, it's Don. On today's episode of The Naturalist, I'm in Ripley, Ohio to learn all about the history of tobacco production in Ohio. So let's go. Ripley, Ohio is about an hour upriver from Cincinnati. And in this area, we have about the lowest elevations in Ohio you can get and the warmest average temperatures. So we're going to learn about how those kinds of factors, along with other factors, permitted tobacco growing in this part of Ohio, which was something I was unfamiliar with back growing up in Pennsylvania. So let's take a look. This is Front Street in Ripley. And this is a large pool of the Ohio River, and we're near some marinas right here. And so there's a lot of activity out there today. It's a nice hot day and good to be out in the water. So let's go to the museum and see what tobacco growing in Ohio is all about. We're here at the Ohio Tobacco Museum in Ripley, Ohio, and I have a couple of tour guides today that I'd like you to meet. So
I'm Jan Napier, and I volunteer here at the museum, and my history is basically as a tobacco farmer in this region, born and raised.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Larry Hall. I'm a retired tobacco farmer. I live about 10 miles from the museum here. I'm on the board, and the whole idea was to save the museum and preserve the tobacco history of the state as we know it.
So that's one of the reasons I'm here, is I'd like to learn about the history of tobacco growing in Ohio. As I said previously, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and when I read and learned about tobacco production, I thought Virginia, North Carolina, those kinds of places. That's what I read about and saw, and I didn't see any in Pennsylvania, although there might have been some historically. And when I moved to Ohio, I remember seeing a few tobacco fields in Adams County and getting curious about tobacco production and the history of it in Ohio. So today at the museum, Jan will take us on a tour of the museum, and we'll learn, the history of it and what this museum is all about, what it contains that you might see if you could visit. So
Yes.
Take it away.
So this is our Hall of Fame museum, our area, and we have pictures of people who actually were instrumental in the tobacco market or the tobacco science of growing in this region. The museum itself was started in 1986 by some farmers who wanted to preserve the history, and opened in this building in 1988. Everything here has been donated to us, and it is kind of our duty to preserve it and keep it alive in people's memory, because tobacco isn't so much grown around here anymore.
Yeah.
It started out, if we go over to the other
Sure.
room, we can tell you about why it grew in Ripley. So tobacco was grown in Ripley mainly because we had access to shipping. So it started here. We had the river to ship out of, and the history of it has been for a few millennia, with Native Americans grew tobacco. They traded it like money when Europeans came to the Americas, and they actually used it as cash. So kind of go through the history of that, and to ship it out when they came to this region was the river and eventually the railroads. And then lastly, 3 major highways converge in Ripley, with a short jaunt across the river into the southern states, which is where the tobacco goes to finish production. Mm-hmm. It grows in this region because of the soil type. We do have, being just a little further south, we have the growing season that tobacco requires. It's a little bit longer. And also, tobacco doesn't like to be really wet. So if you look around us, we have hills. It drains well. So that kept that from being too damp and too wet for the type of tobacco to grow here. Mm-hmm. Actually, in 1864, white burley tobacco was developed in Higginsford, just down the road from us. And accidentally, somebody was sowing their tobacco seeds. So this was Civil War time, and he ran out of seed to sow a seed bed. He went across the river, borrowed some seed from a friend, different type of tobacco, finished seeding his bed. When it started to grow, he cross-pollinated, and then he had something with a much lighter colored leaf. And they found out it was really good for cigarette tobacco, and so it had different flavor to it, and so it grew in popularity till it's one of the most commonly grown tobaccos.
Was it the only kind of tobacco grown in Ohio, or were there others?
Burley, I think, was the only kind, although we do have different kinds of tobacco grown here. There is like cigar leaf tobacco grown, but it's not been wasn't grown as much as Burley. And it was at one time, every small farmer around here had a crop of Burley tobacco. It paid the bills.
So when do we know tobacco growing started in Ohio at first, at the beginning?
I don't really know the answer to that
We
question.
talking 1700s, even earlier, or?
Well, Ripley wasn't actually even established till the
Incorporated,
1800s, so I'm saying somewhere in that time. So probably early 1800s. This building itself was built in 1854. I think there was probably tobacco markets along at the time, so I don't really know the answer to that question.
Okay.
So it's a good one though. I might have to do more research. But it was, like I said, it was a crop for small farmers, because you might have a dairy and you might have milk cows and you may have beef cattle, but sometimes that didn't always pay the bills. So this gave us money for a new tractor. It gave us money for college education. It gave us money for Christmas. Sometimes people would try to get a load of tobacco on the market before Christmas so they would be able to do Christmas for their kids. It's kind of, was that extra. As time passed, laws changed. So in 2004, there's what we call the buyout, or the tobacco transition payment started, and the government stepped back from the price support system, took tobacco out of that. And so the auctions closed, and people started selling tobacco by contract. So you would contract with a grower at that point, and you would haul your tobacco to them, and then your contract would be to sell it for so much, which you may or may not get, depending on the quality of your tobacco. But it reduced the number of tobacco farms here. And so we have a few farmers still growing tobacco here, but they're much bigger acreage. So maybe 50 acres of tobacco, where before we had maybe a grower might have 2 to 5 acres.
Okay.
So
Do you know
things.
the total acreage in, say, in Ohio period, or in this region in tobacco now?
I do not have that information. I have it on my phone.
Oh, that's okay.
But I don't have it right at the top of my head. Larry, do you know the answer?
My
to
guess
that
is
question?
it's substantially down from a peak, right?
Well, at its
Yes.
peak in Ohio, there was probably 12 to 13,000 acres grown. And now I would say you would be lucky to find 250.
Okay,
So it's changed a lot.
So the former, before we get into the actual growing of it, the former tobacco farms, are they converted to something else that's considered, say, a specialty crop, or just what's happened to the farms that used to be tobacco farms?
They're hanging on, I guess. Basically here, you needed tobacco, as she alluded to. You have smaller fields around here, not big open spaces as you would up farther in Ohio. And so grain wasn't too profitable. But tobacco, for the acreage that you needed, you could sell it and make a living and pay your bills and pay the mortgages. Tobacco was known for paying mortgages around here. And as Jan alluded to, at Christmas it was really important, because the way tobacco was sold and planted, it's planted in late May, early June, and then it was harvested in August, September. And then it takes a while. The thing unique about Burley tobacco is it's what we would call air cured, in which you actually hang it in the barn and let the air gradually cure it.
Should we step in here and talk about that?
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, this shows some hands of tobacco that it's as you see it, this is on this wooden stick. Well, this stick, when tobacco was green, you would take it out to the field and drop it. People had different characteristics as like, do you put 5 plants to a stick or do you put 6? Everybody had their own theory. But then you would hang the stick in the barn and let the tobacco cure. And after it cured, it's very dry if the humidity is not up. You hear that rustle.
Yeah.
And so you had to wait until what we farmers would call it's in case, meaning simply there was enough moisture that you could handle the leaf without it crumbling. And then you would take it down, go to a little stripping room and strip it leaf by leaf off the stalk. And there might be typically anywhere from 15 to 20 leaves that you would harvest off the stalk. Unlike probably in the South where flue-cured tobacco, as I said, burley was air-cured. Flue-cured tobacco, which is grown a lot in the South, is forced air-cured. In other words, they put it in, they take the leaf off and they put it in a barn and they use gas heat or wood heat, fire it up to cure it down, and so it cures much quicker. Burley being a different type of tobacco, plus being air-cured, gives it the qualities that made it evidently good that people liked for cigarettes.
And then they would hang in a barn or structure, something like this, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And typically it may take, what?
6-8 weeks.
6-8 weeks to cure to where you could handle it.
Now, was any of this mechanized, or this is all manual labor?
This is
right?
all manual labor so far. Then there are other things that come in. I mean, when we first started, I'm sure when they first grew it, it was transplanted into the fields by hand. Dig a little hole. We have some sticks in here that show you where you punch a hole in the ground and put your plant in it.
Yeah.
Later on, it became mechanized, and we had tobacco setters. But basically, it was who raised tobacco. You needed the right ground, and labor was always a problem. Labor and barns to cure it in, because I said it's very important to burley tobacco that it be cured right to give it the texture and the flavor that you want. So who had the barns and who had the labor could raise the tobacco.
Right.
But having said that, it returned enough money on a small acreage that people could pay the mortgage.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons it caught on here in Southern Ohio.
Sure. So at this stage, what are we seeing at this stage here? And what is this contraption here?
This is just some hand-tied tobacco. It's not on a stick anymore, and they put it in plastic here just to preserve it so that it would hold it. And it's in one of these baskets. And I'll turn you back over to the marketing group here to tell you about the basket.
So after the tobacco was stripped, the farmer would compress it in what we called either a wall press or something to make it a little more compact. And then it was hauled to one of the auction houses here in Ripley. We had 4. We had the Independent, Union, Farmers, and OK. And so then after it was there, it was sold by auction. And it was kind of really a big thing, because the auctions would go on, and you would have your buyers in town from North Carolina. You would have your government graders would come in and they would place a grade on the tobacco, and your auctioneer would go through and sell it. Your buyers would come through and bid. And then you'd have all the people that worked in the warehouse locally who would come in and tag it, load it, unload it, and then it was shipped out. Originally in hogsheads, so great big round barrels as they would ship, and that's how they measured tobacco. And then eventually it went to a different system. But that tobacco basket was what they would have placed the hands on. And if you want to come on in this room, I can show you where what that actually looked like on the market floor. So if you see, this is what tobacco's hands placed on a basket would look like.
And is that a standard, I mean, is there a certain weight of each of these or volume, or how is that?
Generally, it was done basically by weight, okay? So it was, and these weight might be like, if you saw a small basket, it might be the end of one farmer's crop. So what you're seeing here is a transition. Okay, so we went from stripping it and tying it into hands to something that was a little speedier, which was stripping it and dropping it into a bale box. And it was actually baled. And we tried to keep them around an 80 to 100 pound bale. And then they were actually sold looking more like this.
Okay, I see. Okay, so this
So
looser and kind of tighter in some sense. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So originally in 1933, they passed an Agricultural Adjustment Act that protected farmers, and we had kind of, it started with the cotton farmers in Georgia, and they had a agreement with farmers to only grow so much of a crop. So tobacco was included in that. And you know, the farmers voted on it because what happened is if you oversupply your market, your price drops, your farmers go under, and we can't eat without our farmers.
Yeah, you undermine the business.
So you never knew what the other person was doing, but with that kind of program, it enabled them to do some price control, and that was helpful to keep some of the farmers in business. So, like I said, it started out with cotton because the Georgia farmers were going to go under because they overgrew too much cotton. They couldn't market it, so we went to this. So the process that we went from to get here was some of these things behind you. Now, tobacco seed is very, very small. It looks, I don't know if you can see this or not, but that's what tobacco seed looks like. So
very fine.
Very
if you can't
fine.
see this on camera, it's like sand.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so people would sow it in a bed, cover it with a canvas, which that around there is a canvas. Oh, there's a canvas, kind of a cotton canvas, and it would, start to sprout eventually. And then you would pull the plants and you would bundle them in a burlap bag, and you would take them out to the field and set them. But one of the labor-saving things that came along was pelletized seeds. So they coated the seeds, and then they figured out that we could grow them in these little slots, which was mechanized as well. You had like a vacuum that would pull the seed in. It would go in little holes. You would slide this under with dirt in it, would drop the seed down in, and you would put these on water.
Okay, so that's styrofoam, correct?
Yes, it is styrofoam. And you would put your fertilizer in the water. You would cover the bed with Ripley, which is what our curtains are made out of. So you would cover it to protect the seed, from too much of the rain, too much sunlight, everything until it sprouted. Now, as your tobacco plants came up and you were ready to set them, you could pull these out of the bed and just take them out to the field. And if your tractor broke down, someone got sick, it started to rain, whatever, you could just quit and put these back into the bed, the water bed, the float bed, in order to set another day. Whereas when you pulled plants out of the ground, you might bundle them, you would put them in a cool place and hope you could keep them from rotting. And you might lose your plants that way if one of those other things happened again. But this saved a lot of work. Plus, I didn't really like to pull plants very well. It was hard.
So you've done this yourself?
Yes, sir.
Right. And you as well.
Retired.
Yeah.
My husband and I had our last crop in 2016.
16, okay.
So we were actually selling on contract after that. Initially, so we were allotted, you had an allotment of acreage. And if they came out and you were allotted 2 acres and you had 2.5, you had to bush hog half an acre down. So that was checked. And then somebody got smarter and said, hey, why don't we just set that allotment on pounds, and then we will give them a marketing card, and they can come into the warehouse and they can only sell so many pounds. So you could raise as many pounds as you wanted to, but you could only sell your allotment. And so they were able to control it that way, and that did somebody out of a job. But
Can you store tobacco? Like if they
can be
sold
stored.
the allotment for 1 year, can you keep it for the next year?
Yeah. And that's part of what, when I said there was a price protection, is what happened was if you took your tobacco to the warehouse and it did not sell or for the going price, then it would be purchased by the government and put in a hold, sold again when the supply was low and the demand was high, sold again, and then the government got their money back. So
Right.
that's kind of how that system works for everything. Cotton works for corn, wheat, everything. I don't think beef cattle, it does not.
No, I don't think they have
No,
any.
but all your commodity crops will work the same way.
Yeah.
So when you came around, originally they were setting over here by pegs, and there are some little pegs here, and there's a couple up there where they would actually lean over. I'm sure my grandparents set tobacco that way. I still have their pegs, and they would lean over and do it completely by hand that way. Then we had a little transplanter that worked, and you could add water to it. But then with the development of more mechanized, we had tobacco setters. Originally they were pulled by horses and they were more like a sled that slid behind, but that's what tobacco looked like being set with a mechanical transplanter. So you would set the tobacco, and then if it wasn't very weedy, you were good. But if it was, you would have to hoe it, cultivate it, because after a rain and the ground gets hard, you'd want to cultivate it so that when it rained again, it could actually absorb the moisture to it. So we go through all that part, and we've hoed it, and then you come to this part where you actually top it. So you're going to break out the bloom. So the bloom is where the seed's made, and you break that bloom out because you don't want that plant to put its energy into growing seed. You want it to put into developing the leaves. Break the bloom out, and your leaves would get longer, broader, and a better quality leaf. Then came the hard part. I guess the most labor-intensive, hot, sweaty part was cutting tobacco. It's all done by hand, and as Larry said before, they would take those tobacco sticks. I have one here. Sorry to move around
Okay,
on you here.
that's all right.
But you have a tobacco stick,
Oh yeah, that's
and you have a spear.
yeah.
Okay, like this. You would take what we call a tobacco knife, and you would lean over and whoosh, and put it on there. And you would do 5 or 6 plants, and then you would pull that off, pick up the next stick, and go on.
I see. Okay.
And that would be how that would work.
I was wondering at first why it comes off, but now I see.
Because
Yeah.
you use the same spear. The most accidents we've ever had occur happened with people putting their arms down on that spear.
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah, so. But anyway, this picture here shows you cutting them tobacco.
Yep.
So then they would lay in the field, and you might let it, some of the moisture go out of it a little bit so that it didn't crack and wasn't as brittle when you went to load it. And then you would load it. And this is where I came in. I was either the tractor driver or the picker-upper out of the field. So I could never load a tobacco that would, on a wagon that would stay, because I didn't have the upper body strength in order to do that. So once that was done, then it was put in the barn. My father didn't believe that women should be up in the barn, so I was not up there. I handed off the wagon. So you would hand each stick up the wagon, and it would go up those tiers to the guy on the top who handled it the least, and he would spread it so that the air could cure. Depending on the weather, these shutters that you can see, if you can see those on the barn, would be open or closed to control the weather and humidity, and that would allow the tobacco to cure or come in case, or however you needed to handle that. You could control it some way.
Yeah.
Somewhat. So it would look like this as it started to cure, and then it would go to this kind of, and it had a distinct odor to it. I found it pleasant.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
This is pleasant odor. Sorry. And then it would look like this when you went to take it down. And like you said, you might want it in case and a little bit easier to strip.
Can I ask too, what with all this physical handling of tobacco, did you absorb nicotine from that? And could you feel an effect of just simply handling tobacco as you worked with it?
So Yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? If you walked out into a field that was wet,
Mm-hmm.
and there is something called green tobacco illness,
Mm-hmm.
you could get nicotine absorption.
Like
Through your
overdose
skin.
kind of
Yeah.
poisoning.
People would
Mhm.
get sick, nicotine poisoning.
Yeah,
So you didn't.
yeah,
You just didn't do it.
yeah.
You wore long sleeves if you were going into a wet field, or you stayed out of a wet field,
Mhm.
and you just didn't. You waited till it dried. Otherwise, no, you didn't absorb the nicotine. I never felt it.
Mhm.
I worked in tobacco all my life.
Mhm.
I'm a nurse.
Yeah.
I mean, I did not.
Right.
So then you get to the point where you've got it cured. Now that's when my dad would say it was okay for me to climb in the barn
Yeah.
because he needed me.
Yeah, yeah.
So I would climb up in the barn and hand it tobacco down. We would take it down, put it in bundles, which you can see in this picture down here. We would strip it.
Mhm.
Here's the baling process. I can still tie a hand to tobacco, but it wasn't in the last years, wasn't necessary. And then those are bales. Then you would haul it to market, which would be the auction houses down here in Ripley. There are multiple across the river. It's because Kentucky and North Carolina grew the most tobacco.
Yeah.
So, like I said, they had the better, longer growing season, and they were your more higher burly producers.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the nicotine production and dynamics in the plant itself, and maybe a little bit about pests and diseases of tobacco.
Well, one of the things that I found most interesting about tobacco that most people don't realize, that if you take the plant and you break this flower out, and as Jan said, one of the reasons we do that is to put the nutrients into making leaves, because that's what we sell, that's what we need. But the interesting thing is, in tobacco, we smoke it because of what? Nicotine. Well, the funny thing about tobacco is 90% of the nicotine in tobacco comes from the root tips in the ground. And being a plant, when you break the top out of this plant, you temporarily throw off the balance of the hormones that govern root control. So when you break that top, nicotine production gets a big boost because the roots just go wild. There's no governance anymore for a little while. Eventually the plant will sort of even itself out. So you get a lot of nicotine added then when you break that flower out, and it sends the nicotine up to the leaves, which I think is very interesting because you just normally wouldn't think of it that way.
Now, I know of nicotine as also what we call an inducible defense in the plant insect world, where things like wounding will induce the production as well. Just wounding leaves or caterpillars chewing on the leaves will actually make the plant produce more. And I wonder if that wounding, that breaking of the flowers out, is a little bit of a signal as well, of like a wound signal that triggers the plant to make more.
I can't say indefinitely, but I would say yes, probably that's part of it. The plants, I've got something here that might take care of my problem. Like you said, I've been wounded. What do I do? How do I save myself? And that would be a reaction also to that.
So what kind of pests and disease issues are there with tobacco?
A young plant, aphids seem to like it when it's very small and it's setting in the field. As the plants get bigger, caterpillars, what we typically would call, and I'm not sure what the name is, tobacco worms. I don't know
Tobacco
what the
hornworms.
science, tobacco worms, and they love it.
Manduca sexta.
They'll just eat it up. They love it. Once you can cut it and get it in the barn, it's usually not much of a problem, but it's in the field that it can be the biggest problem. But as you said, it has nicotine, which nicotine is used in a lot of organic insecticides.
Sure, yeah. I think it was one of the first purified insecticides from plants.
Yes,
yeah.
I think so.
Here's one of those hornworms, nice big fat one, which some people might recognize from their backyard and their tomatoes. Those things can defoliate a tomato plant in a day.
In no time.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about the tobacco plant is, you have different leaves. Okay, when you strip it, you would sort them. So you would put like the trash or flines at the bottom, and then the lugs or cutters, the leaf, and the tips. And as you're stripping, you pass off to the next person, and you would sort those into different types. They would be put in different hands and different bales. And where the leaf occurs on the plant will also influence the taste of the tobacco as it's used in its end product. It's kind of an interesting little thing there. So once it went to market, up until 2004, it went through the warehouses and was sold at auction. And like I said, we have a government graders came through, and they would tell you how what grade it was, either F1 or whatever.
That's what these fellows are here, graders?
That's what these are. Then you have an auctioneer who goes through, and we'll show you let you listen to some of the auctioneers chant.
Okay.
And then you have buyers. So they would go through and they would bid on it. And it was really interesting because I couldn't always understand I still don't always understand what an auctioneer says. But then you had the tobacco, the people who worked in the warehouse, which was a good winter job for a lot of people who had different jobs during the summer, but they worked at the warehouse during the winter, so it helped employment in this area. Would go through and they would tag the tobacco and make sure it was offloaded to the right trucks, and so on and so forth. Right up here in the corner, I talked about marketing cards earlier, and that's what a marketing card actually looked like. Was handed out by the USDA.
Okay, so these fellows here would all, I'm sorry, the farmers would have these, or?
The farmers would have the marketing card.
Got it,
sorry.
okay.
Yeah, I skipped.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
But these are all, like I said, I recognize this guy as a buyer. Okay.
Yeah, okay. I noticed how much he's smoking. He has a little cigarillo.
Yeah. My dad had 7 kids.
Yeah.
My dad smoked.
Yeah.
None of us did.
Yeah.
So
That's interesting.
Just add as it is. You also had a ticket marker, which was I think the same ticket marker in Ripley went to all 4 markets, because they would start out at one warehouse and move through. And when they got to the 4th one, they were done for the day. It's kind of like if you went to the stock market, and you see all the tickets flying everywhere. They don't do it that way anymore.
Yeah.
But he would mark the tickets. He would travel with the sales team, and they would go from warehouse to warehouse that way. And he would mark all the tickets. And then we've got the
let's hear let's listen to what an auction sounded like. It's really sing-songy, right? It's almost like bluegrass or something.
They have their own chant, their own chant. Rhythm. Every auctioneer might be just a little bit different, but you would learn, if you worked with them long enough, you'd learn to listen to that. So, you get your check from the warehouse at that point. If, for some reason, you didn't sell, this is how the Burley market worked up until 2004. You took it in, so you brought in your crop, and it either sold and went out to the cigarette company, or it had price support, went to the farmer cooperative, U.S. government, came back around and went through the process again and was sold at a later point. So, but in any case, the farmer got to take a check home. And that was, it may be the minimum price, which was set by the co-op, or it might have been a little higher price, which was what you obtained at auction. So it depended on the amount of tobacco that each buyer needed to fill their quota. So it was a thing. Tobacco offered, just for Ohio, its economic impact. But it was great. For the U.S., it was great. But for this area, it was vital. I would say afterward, it became more of a struggle for small farmers in this region to stay, continue farming. Even before my father's time, which would have been in the 40s, somebody was always working off the farm in order to keep the farm going. So it was kind of boon to this area.
Right. When would you say the peak years, roughly, decades?
1960s.
60s. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think probably 60s, maybe 70s, but then after that it started to go off a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And we would, it was a way of life.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why, too, families became smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I mentioned there are 7 in my family.
Mm-hmm.
We worked together.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the best memories from all of our childhoods. We're like, okay, do you remember that time we did this or that? But so we worked, and then as my brothers got older and they had their own crops, we would go to their farm and we would do theirs, and we'd go around. Sometimes then we would finish, I would get an extra job,
Mm-hmm.
working in the neighbor's tobacco. In an area where employment for teenagers wasn't really that good.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then when families got smaller and it was more difficult to get labor.
Right.
Nobody, when I was a teenager, a male my age could work for a month or two during the summer, the end of the summer, housing tobacco,
Mm-hmm.
and make more money and have a car than I could babysitting every single night of every single weekend
Mm-hmm.
throughout the entire year.
Yeah.
So, it gave some to this area. Like I said, it helped with college educations, it helped people go on, but the loss of that also was a financial problem for this area.
Mm-hmm.
To the 2 warehouses that are left, one of them is a flea market,
Mm-hmm.
and the other is an auction house for, they sell furniture and stuff like that through auction.
This reminds me, so where I grew up in Pennsylvania was known as a Christmas tree growing area.
Mm-hmm.
And just like you said, it took a lot of manual labor to trim the trees in the summer.
It had
And I
to be
knew a lot of
privileged.
guys, a lot of people who would go out as a summer job trimming Christmas trees with a machete-like tool,
Yes.
basically. And yeah, it was a specialty thing that was grown in that county. We were known for it. And yeah, like you said, and then a lot of that's lost too. It's hanging in there back there, but it's a similar kind of story, I think, is the Christmas tree industry.
People changed. Like I said, we've gone to larger farmers growing more. Like I still have a neighbor who grows tobacco, and he has maybe a 60-acre crop.
Mm-hmm.
He gets migrant labor.
Mm-hmm.
Because he can't afford, with that much tobacco, he can afford to go through all the things you have to do to have migrant labor.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas as a small farmer, if we had, the most we ever raised was 15 acres, and that was a big year for us.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly we had around 5. We could not afford to do everything in order to house our tobacco and do all the labor with it.
Yeah.
What we couldn't do ourselves, so we had to quit.
Okay, I understand that there is an upstairs full of mementos and things, but this small room here captures some of that. So why don't you tell me what's in this room?
The hallway here is different brands of chewing tobacco, cigarette packs. People have donated. On the other side, you'll see a display of matchbook covers. It was in every single restaurant, every hotel you went into. People, they had their own matchbooks. And it kept on. People would donate it to us because they say, oh, I've got this around or whatever. So we didn't ever want to turn anything away. So we added those things in here.
There's an interesting one by
Yes,
Pete Rose.
I love that one. And he is somewhere else too. So
Yeah, interesting.
it is interesting.
And again,
Lots
most
of
of
tobacco, cigarette advertising.
most of Ohio's tobacco was cigarette tobacco, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
We did have some cigar leaf wrappers, but it never really caught on. I think Connecticut has some, maybe some in Pennsylvania.
Very cool. All right, well, at this point, I think we're going to head outside. We're going to take a look at some real live growing tobacco plants in a little plot outside. So let's do that. All right, after all that wonderful history of tobacco production in Ohio, we're going to take a look at some real live tobacco plants here. So what are we looking at?
This is some plants that they had the great idea of, there are people that pass through that haven't seen tobacco before, or for those that just want a remembrance. And so we started these in a little float bed, as Jan mentioned before. These were started, and these were transplanted about mid-May from the transplant trays over to here. And so they look like they're doing pretty well. that old Nemesis. You got a few grass weeds in here. As a kid, I hated that because at the time, that meant the hoe.
Oh yeah.
And that was the most boring job that I ever had to do in tobacco. Because Dad would say, now you got a hoe in the middle too, you got to cover up, you got to cover around all around. And it was the most boring, long job that I hated to do in tobacco. And there's a few little grass plants coming here. But the tobacco's doing good.
Yeah, it looks like it's grown. If this are only 3 weeks in, yeah. Now how tall will these get?
Depending on
Overhead height, yeah.
I can reach up. Last year I was reaching up to top.
To top them.
Wanted enough to share.
Yeah.
Leaves with a place downtown that has a tobacco press and they want fresh leaves, so I pump them up.
Yeah, well they look good. And so at this stage, when would the flowering start then? How far out are we from flowering?
probably 6 weeks.
Yeah, I'm gonna say August, you know, right in there, around August time, mid-August. It's a little late this year. We had a cool, wet spring.
Sure.
And again, tobacco likes warm, dry. So we actually had some damage to some of the plants. You can see some of these are not quite right.
Yeah, a little bit, but they look pretty
had
good.
A little bit of, I think it was deer.
Okay.
Now, nibbling on them because there was some damage and it may have kind of come out a little funny. So.
Now, when is the ultimate harvest then? What time of year?
September.
September.
You always figure you're setting tobacco on Memorial Day and you're cutting it on Labor Day. So it about works. And then by Thanksgiving, hopefully you've got some down that you can strip because you want to get it on that. You want to get it before Thanksgiving, before Christmas break.
Right.
You wanted to get it on the auction floor. But like I said, that changed when we started hauling and selling by contract. That changed in 2004.
Right.
So.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. Thanks a lot.
Gummy. I mean,
I noticed that.
It,
Yeah, it's
kind of, you can feel the sticky.
Yeah, there's sort of the exudation. There's some hairiness to it. You know, slight fuzziness to it as well.
And after you're finished, your hands will be black,
covered with
kind of
like gum, tar.
Yeah, you just kind of pull it off, and it's just kind of a different thing.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank the both of you very much for this tour today. This is really interesting. I learned a lot. I think the viewers here will really appreciate this episode. Not many of them know much about this kind of thing. So again, I appreciate the time and I appreciate you being here and keeping this museum open here in Ripley.
Well, we're proud to do it. And we were very happy that you were coming and talking to us, and we look forward to it.
Sure.
Yes, we did.
All right.
Very much. We appreciate it.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I've returned home to conclude this episode back in Greene County, about an hour and a half north of Ripley, Ohio. And I wanted to share with you some stats that Jan shared with me regarding the changes in tobacco production and growing in Ohio over the last several decades. So at the museum, Larry indicated that at its peak, Ohio probably grew 13 to 14,000 acres of tobacco, maybe back in the 1960s at its peak. By 2009, there were tobacco was grown in about 13 counties in southern Ohio, including Greene County, interestingly, where I am now. And there were about 3,300 acres planted in that year. By 2023, the last year where I have some stats, there were only 4 counties where tobacco was grown, and amounting to about 330 acres in that year. And Larry indicated that it might even be down to around 250 acres at this point. So that gives you a little picture of where tobacco has gone through time and why it's important for a place like the Ohio Tobacco Museum to be there, to talk about this history, because it may not be around for that much longer. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the house that we were in. That house where the museum is housed is called the Espy House. And the Espy family were important protectors of Ripley in Ohio during the Civil War. because of their engagement in things regarding artillery and munitions and things like that. So they were a well-known family for those sorts of things, and important in protecting Ripley in that area from Confederate incursion during the Civil War. Ripley itself was also known as an important stop on the Underground Railroad and its history of abolitionism. And so that can also be seen in other historic facilities around Ripley, which I may go back and just visit again in the future. So I would like to conclude this episode by again thanking Jan and Larry on my visit to the museum, as well as Dave Dugan, someone else associated with the museum who I've spoken with as well. If you'd like to donate, you can find the information for the museum on Facebook. You can also email them, and I'll include a text slide here at the end with some acknowledgments. So with that, I'm going to conclude this week's episode. This is Don signing off for this week. Bye-bye.